Good morning. In the last lecture, we have dealt with the Arab conquest in the Middle East. In less than a decade, the newly established Caliphate had taken away from the Roman Empire Syria and Palestine and crushed the Sassanid Empire. We have seen the defeat suffered by Emperor Heraclius in the Battle of Yarmouk, after which he had to abandon the Levant to the Arab armies. We have already met Heraclius in lecture 9, the man who put an end to the tyranny of Phocas, who reformed the Byzantine administration and army, the creator of mobile warfare, who, starting from a nearly hopeless situation, triumphed over Persia with his spectacular incursions into the enemy's heartland. However, Heraclius was also a tragic figure who suffered the anguish of failure on the battlefield in his political designs and his own family. We have analyzed his military failure in the previous lecture, but also the family life of Heraclius was marked by tragedy. He had married in 610, on the same year in which he became emperor. However, Empress Eudokia had died only 2 years later after giving birth to a daughter and a son. On the following year, Heraclius had remarried with his own niece Martina, who would always remain at his side even in the course of his daring military campaigns. However, this second marriage caused scandal because it was considered incestuous. To make matters worse, of the 9 children born out of the marriage with Martina, 4 died in their infancy and 2 were born with malformation, which appeared to be a sign of God's wrath. Much to the regret of Heraclius, Martina remained unpopular with the people, with the patriarch of Constantinople, Sergius I, and with the Senate. Wherefore the question of the imperial succession appeared very complex. I should start by saying that the imperial succession in the Eastern Roman Empire was not regulated by precise rules, and this created a latent danger for the stability of the empire. If an emperor was overthrown, the triumph of the usurper appeared exposed as a divine endorsement to an act of sheer force. A rebel commander or exarch could always try his luck. After all, both Phocas and Heraclius himself had been successful in their uprisings. In order to mitigate this destabilizing element inherent to the imperial institution, it had become normal practice for an emperor in office to appoint his prospective successor as co-regent. The co-regent had obviously much less power, but to begin with, his image appeared beside that of the emperor on the golden coins that circulated throughout the empire, albeit in smaller size. This would help him in the delicate phase of the power transfer. In addition, the institution of the co-regency allowed the coaching of the prospective emperor. Heraclius had already appointed as co-regent his firstborn, the son of Eudokia, Heraclius Constantinus, who was appearing already on the empire's golden coins, the solidi, as Basileus Mikos. However, his second wife wanted the throne for the first of her children born without physical deformities, Heracleonas, still a young boy at that time, 13 years younger than his half-brother. Therefore, in order to please Martina without defrauding his firstborn of his rights, Heraclius first associated Heracleonas in the co-regency, an already anomalous situation, and then established in his will that, after his death, the 2 half-brothers would rule together, in full equality of powers and status. In addition, in order to secure a role for Martina and to mitigate the effect of the age difference between the two co-emperors, he disposed that both of them treated Martina as mother and empress. Therefore, when Heraclius died in 641, the two half-brothers were proclaimed emperors, co-emperors. But Martina faced anyway a fierce opposition to her direct involvement in the state affairs. The two co-emperors did not come to an open confrontation because Heraclius Constantino, also known as Constantine III, died only 3 months later, possibly of tuberculosis, but the widespread hostility towards Martina fed the rumor that he had been poisoned. This ominous political climate would influence the decisions of Martina and Heracleonas, just when the Caliphate was attacking the Eastern Empire in Egypt. In summary, the complex family situation of Heraclius was harbinger of dramatic developments. Finally, Heraclius suffered a political failure, namely in the field of religious reform. We already mentioned the centuries-old conflict between the Orthodox doctrine or Diophysite and the Monophysite one, condemned by the Council of Chalcedon in 451. The term monophysitism derives from the Greek word monos, single, and physis, nature. This doctrine affirmed the prevalence of the divine nature in the person of Christ after his incarnation, and it was popular in Syria and Egypt because it contained an echo of certain ancestral beliefs of the Greek world. In the ancient practices of the Sibyls and of Delphi, the priests had always been considered pure instruments of the god, without any powers of their own, and they prophesied only because the god possessed them briefly and spoke with their voices. This particular vision had influenced the Platonic mystique in its distinction between the soul, the divine essence and agent of human action, and the body, its organ, its pure instrument. For the Monophysites, after the incarnation of the Christ, his human nature had dissolved in his divine one like a drop of honey in the ocean, removing thereby all limitations inherent to humanity, among which original sin. This was the logic behind monophysitism. Anyway, the Diophysite doctrine had prevailed in the Council of Chalcedon in 451 and had been successively adopted by the Byzantine emperors, starting with Justin 1 century before. However, the refusal of some Christian community to accept the council's conclusions had created a schism that continued to represent the political problems which Heraclius tried to tackle. Patriarch Sergius, who had led the defense of Constantinople in 526 and financed the campaigns of Heraclius, had elaborated a doctrine aimed at reconciling Orthodox with Monophysite Christians. In it, he acknowledged that although after the incarnation a divine and a human nature had coexisted in the person of Jesus Christ, there had been in him a single energy, in Greek energeia, a single source for the activities of these two natures. In 529, Heraclius had retaken immense territories from the Sassanid Empire. He needed to bring closer together the fates of his restored empire. Therefore, he supported the doctrine of monoenergism, which gained soon the consensus of several bishops. Even Pope Honorius I in Rome showed an open attitude towards the new doctrine, to the point of suggesting that it might be better to talk of a single will, thelema, instead of a single energy. Nevertheless, in spite of this promising start, the monoenergistic doctrine was rejected by the communities of Egypt and by some representative of the Orthodox Church, like the future patriarch of Jerusalem, Sophronius, and the greatest theologian of the time, Maximus the Confessor. Sergius was determined to reach a compromise and somewhat adjusted his position. The resulting doctrine was formalized in 638 by an edict of Heraclius, the Ekthesis, in Greek, the Exposition. Displayed in the Cathedral of St. Sophia of Constantinople, the edict forbade discussing further the issue of the single energy, but claimed that the two natures of Christ had been guided by a single will. In essence, monothelitism attributed the action of Christ to his divine nature, in which his human one was absorbed. However, also this new doctrine was rejected by the Monophysites and by many Orthodox Christians. In the meantime, Pope Honorius had died, and because of the mounting conflicts between Rome and the Exarchate of Ravenna, the popes that follow him declare their hostility to monothelitism. Thus, the attempt of Heraclius to reunite the Christian ecumeny had proven a failure. Not only the religious conflict had been exacerbated, but Maximus the Confessor started to question the very right of the emperors to rule in religious matter, a precedent to the conflict between the Church and the Empire that would continually resurface in different forms and places throughout the Middle Ages. A few years later, Maximus would pay dearly for his opposition to the imperial authority. He died in captivity after having his tongue and right hand cut off. In conclusion, the contrast between the religious disputes rampant in the Eastern Roman Empire and the new faith founded by Muhammad, with its limited number of precepts and the almost unconditional obedience due to the Caliph, could not have been greater. The doctrinal controversies of the empire were not confined to the elite, but manifested themselves in the persecution of entire communities. What, considering the subtle distinction that inflamed the disputes, might appear today almost as collective madness. But it is not uncommon in history that ideological contests harden in the course of time to the point of preventing the contenders from seeing much greater threats. In this respect, let's take, for example, the situation in Egypt. Its population had always been concentrated in a few cities along the Nile, in a few oases, and in the Delta, an area named after the Greek capital letter of triangular form. In the Nile Delta, one of the world's less warlike people had been living for millennia. Their hard work, regulated by a meticulous system of corvée, maintained an admirable irrigation system, which produced Egypt's three main commodities: wheat, linen, and papyrus. Within such immutable framework, Egypt's population at the time of Heraclius was relatively scarce. Maybe some 3 million people after the Justinian plague had decimated it a century before. For what concerns cultural aspects, the granary of the empire was a country profoundly different from what people might imagine today. Between the Egypt of the pharaohs and the Islamic civilization, there was a millennium of Graeco-Roman culture, lasting from the deposition of the last pharaoh by Alexander the Great to the Arab conquest. At the time of Heraclius, the Egypt of the pharaohs was a very, very distant past. Already 700 years before, when Julius Caesar had visited Cleopatra, it had been difficult to find an old priest still capable of reading hieroglyphs and answering possible questions of the eminent guest, guided through the imposing temples. At the time of the Ptolemies, Greek had become the dominant language of Egypt, and it continued to be such at the time of Heraclius. The ancient language of Egypt, belonging like Semitic languages to the Afroasiatic family, was also widespread, but it was since long written down with the Greek alphabet, to which a few letters had been added to reflect phonetical differences. At the time of Heraclius, there were practically no contacts with the Arab world. The Arabs referred to the Egyptians as Copt, from the Greek term Aegyptios, Egyptian. From there comes the term Copts, used to indicate native Egyptians, whom the Arabs distinguished from the Rum, that is the Romans, i.e. the Byzantines. Apart then for its fertile delta, Egypt was famous for its metropolis, Alexandria. During the Roman Empire, Alexandria had not only been one of the main ports, but also one of the main learning centers of the Mediterranean. Several religions had seen the light and competing with each other in Alexandria. Even after Christianism prevailed, the city retained its intellectual preeminence. The catechetical school of Alexandria had been, with that of Antiochia, the main center of the biblical exegesis and theology in the late antiquity, with Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century and the great Origen in the 3rd. In the 4th centuries, Arius had given his name to the branch of Christianism that became the religion of many Germanic people. But also Arius' fiercest opponent, Athanasius, had lived in Alexandria and written there the life of Antony, a true bestseller of the late antiquity, a book that helped to spread monasticism in the whole Mediterranean world. Even Monophysites had been the product of the theological school of Alexandria. The patriarch of Alexandria considered himself, like those of Constantinople, Antioch, and Jerusalem, at the same level with the Pope of Rome in the Christian hierarchy. He was appointed by the emperor and was an exponent of the Chalcedonian Orthodoxy, to which all Byzantine emperors belonged. The Egyptians, however, were mainly Monophysites. The Coptic Church considered the patriarch appointed by Constantinople as heretical and elected his own patriarchs. The drift between the Orthodox and the Coptic Church had been widening over time until the war between the Roman Empire and Persia had fallen upon Egypt. Towards 614, the country began to fill with refugees from Palestine. In 617, the first Sassanid army arrived. In 619, the Persians had taken Alexandria and their armies had spread across the whole country. There were some destructions of churches and monasteries, but the Persians had not tried to convert the Christians of Egypt, as they had not persecuted the non-Orthodox Christians of Syria and Mesopotamia. After the war's end in 629, the Persian troops left peacefully the country, but a bitter surprise awaited the people of Egypt. In 631, the new patriarch Cyrus arrived in Alexandria. Heraclius had appointed him patriarch and governor of Egypt, and in this double role he had unlimited powers to pursue the reunification between Orthodox and Monophysite communities by means of the monotheistic doctrine. Cyrus was a bishop from the Caucasus, whence Heraclius had launched his campaigns against the Sassanids in 626. He knew nothing about Egypt and had spent his whole life in a region mobilized for war. Ominous signs must have preceded his arrival if the Coptic patriarch Benjamin, a young man with great influence on his community, left overnight Alexandria and went into hiding. As we mentioned in Lecture 9, more than 20 years of total war with Persia, fought under the banner of religion, had left the Roman Empire less cosmopolitan and more intolerant. The attempt at reconciliation of the new plenipotentiary of Constantinople in Egypt turned very soon into a systematic persecution of the Monophysites. Benjamin managed to escape the Byzantine troops by hiding in a remote monastery in southern Egypt, but his brother Minas was arrested, horribly tortured for days with the purpose of making him abjure his faith, and eventually drowned in the sea. The persecution had been lasting for years when Amr bin al-As, the commander of the Arab forces in southern Palestine, set his eyes upon Egypt. After the Battle of Yarmouk of 636, Syria and Palestine had fallen under the control of the Caliphate. A few months later, the same fate had befallen Mesopotamia. Those were very large regions, but the Arabs did not paralyze their armies to occupy them. They were conquerors rather than occupants. They wanted taxes for Medina, not land on which to settle. For this reason, the conquests continued, sustained by the enormous sense of confirmation that pervaded the Caliphate armies. Within very few years, a destitute and despised people had defeated the two major empires of the world, conquered immense territories, entered triumphantly great cities like Antioch, Ctesiphon, and Jerusalem. How could the leaders of Islam have doubted about the support of God? Each of them felt to be an instrument of his will, called to free up other people from the oppression of the unbelievers. Part of an advance that would end for each one of them with the reward of heaven. It was certainly in that spirit that Amr came to Egypt. Probably the trigger of the expedition was the non-payment of tributes. Egypt's governor and Orthodox Patriarch Cyrus, fearing that Egypt might suffer the same fate of Syria and Palestine, had negotiated with Amr the payment of tributes in the hope to avert an invasion. However, in 639, Heraclius, angered for the humiliating stipulations, recalled Cyrus, accused him of connivance with the Caliphate, and replaced him with a military governor. The loss of the expected payment stream provoked the Arab invasion. This was a risky undertaking for an army probably composed of 3,000 to 4,000 men. It meant entering into unknown territories, devoid of any Arabic-speaking population, dotted with walled towns and fortresses, and far from any possible reinforcement from Medina. Amr moved from Gaza along the Mediterranean coast. Leaving behind him the Sinai Peninsula, he approached the Nile Delta region, guarded on the east by the ancient fortified city of Pelusium. The city fell after a relatively short siege. At this point, rather than entering into the maze of ditches, fields, and villages of the delta, the Arabs turned south, moving along its eastern border by keeping themselves in their own element, the desert. Their ability to survive in the world's most barren wastes allowed them to pick their battles. From the desert, they observed and scouted the farmland. If they spotted strong enemy contingents, they withdrew. If they found insufficient defenses, they attacked. Thus, moving along the borders of the delta, they first conquered a couple of other secondary locations. Then they appeared in the great oasis of Fayoum on the south of it, and they took a city further south along the Nile, where they killed many people. The mobility of the Arab army left the imperial forces unable to react. When Heraclius eventually imposed a counterattack, it was too late. Reinforcements from Medina had already arrived, so that the troops of ʿUmar were by then 3 times as many. At that point, only a major battle could have stopped the invasion. Eventually, in July 640, the Byzantine army attacked, but it suffered a defeat and retreated into the fortress of Babylon, built more than 5 centuries early by the Emperor Trajan at the southern tip of the Nile Delta. The Arabs camped in front of the fortress, which was on the Nile and could therefore get water and be supplied with food. The siege lasted many months because ʿUmar didn't have the means to capture this true bulwark of the imperial forces on the Delta. However, in February 641, news came of the death of Heraclius in Constantinople. The emperor had left the complex situation that we have described with his rival sons to manage the empire, and this probably left the besieged little hope of a rescue expedition. On the other hand, no help had been coming from the Delta. If the Copts had not been oppressed for a decade, they could perhaps have been trained and organized to break the siege. After all, the Byzantines still controlled the whole Delta and the capital of Egypt, Alexandria. Thus, the fortress of Babylon eventually surrendered, giving to the Caliphate army access to the whole Delta. The Byzantines left with some of their gold, but abandoned their weapons to the enemy, a priceless booty in a region where iron had always been scarce. We knew from the chronicle of John, the Coptic bishop of Nicaea, one of the cities of the Delta, that the Byzantine had kept a number of Copt hostages in the fortress, and that before surrendering they flogged them and cut off their hands. If this gruesome episode is true, it indicates that the Copts were considered responsible for the outcome of the siege. After conquering Babylon, ʿUmar moved towards Alexandria. There were still a couple of battles, but before long the Arabs controlled most of the Delta. The capital of Egypt lay northwest of it, on a strip of land between a huge coastal lagoon, the Mareotis, and the sea. Massive walls defended the city, and the Byzantine navy could have easily supplied during the siege. But once again, the political developments in Constantinople sealed the fate of the city. Constantine III, the older of the 2 sons of Heraclius that had become jointly emperors, had suddenly died. His half-brother Heracleonas and his mother Martina, unpopular with the aristocracy, the church, and the militaries, were now suspected of having poisoned him. The imminent danger led the couple to a fatal decision. As said before, Patriarch Cyrus, after reaching an agreement with the Arabs, had been removed from power by Heraclius and repatriated. Martina and Heracleonas, however, sent him back to Egypt to try and close another deal with the invaders. Probably they did that in order to avoid sending troops to Egypt when they feared a military uprising. Anyway, Cyrus returned to Alexandria, and without revealing his intention to the population, went to negotiate with ʿUmar the capital surrender. He signed an agreement by which Alexandria would start immediately to pay a tribute, while the Byzantine troops and civil servants would have 11 months to sail away with their families and belongings. Upon his return, Cyrus did not dare to confess what he had done. When, a few weeks later, the Arab army showed up before the gates of Alexandria to collect the tribute, it became inevitable to inform the people of Alexandria, who was rushing to defend the city, that the capitulation had already been signed. Cyrus, in tears, disclosed the terms of the agreement with ʿUmar and risked being stoned to death by the incredulous, overwhelmed crowd. It was anyway too late to undo what he had done. During the months of the truce, the Byzantine gradually left Alexandria. Cyrus died shortly afterwards, apparently tormented by the remorse. His motives are not entirely clear to us. Maybe he had believed from the beginning in the victory of the Arabs and had tried to ingratiate himself with them, fearing that they, once victorious, handed him over to the Copts, who would then take revenge for the persecution suffered. The Monophysite patriarch Benjamin, who had been hiding during 30 years, returned to Alexandria and established a good relationship with ʿUmar. The Coptic Church flourished thereafter, and Benjamin remained his patriarch until 661. In his homilies, in those of his successor Agathon, and in other Coptic works, the arrival of the Arabs would be praised as a gift of the divine providence, freeing the Coptic Church from its persecutors. At the expiration of the truce period in September 642, with the entire country already under the control of the Caliphate, the last Byzantine ships left Alexandria. On September 29, ʿUmar entered into the city. On that day ended the millennium of Graeco-Roman history for the greatest metropolis of the ancient world. In the meantime, having sent Cyrus back to Egypt, had not saved Martina and Heraclius. An Armenian general loyal to the late co-emperor Valentinus, after stationing his troops menacingly on the Bosphorus, forced the couple to associate in the regency the son of Constantine III, a boy of 11 years, whom the people called Costas, a diminutive nickname of Constantine, as Heraclius was a diminutive nickname of Heraclius. Behind him, initially, a group of senators ruled the empire. This young man would remain in power for a long time, from 641 to 668, and become known as Constans II. We have already met him in Lecture 8. You might remember how his ill-fated expedition in Italy crashed against the hardiness of the Lombard armies. The imposition of Constans II in the co-regency was only the beginning of Martina and Heraclius' political demise. 6 months later, Valentinus rebelled again. At this point, the Senate had the couple arrested, deposed and exiled, not without inflicting them a cruel mutilation. Martina had her tongue and Heraclius his nose cut off. Cutting off one's nose was a barbarous oriental custom, preventing the disfigured person from ever covering a public office again. As we will see in another lecture, the Byzantine will use it again. With Constans II, the Eastern Empire had once again a single emperor. But Martina and Heraclius' vain attempt to stay in power had produced irreversible consequences. It happens frequently in history. The decision taken for contingent political reasons change permanently the fate of entire peoples. Egypt has remained since then an Islamic country. A couple of years later, Constans II tried to recover from the debacle in Egypt by sending to Alexandria a large fleet. The Byzantine army managed to retake the city, but the passive hostility of the Copts did not allow regaining the control of the delta. Its population did not rise up against the Arabs, and the Byzantines, defeated by ʿUmar at Nicaea in 646, found themselves besieging Alexandria. This time the city was taken by force and with great bloodshed, although part of the Byzantine troops managed to flee by sea. The Coptic citizens, headed by Benjamin, formally submitted to the Arabs, declaring their preference for the rule of the Caliphate to that of Constantinople. Egypt's ties with the Mediterranean were irreversibly cut off. To make a long story short, the conquest of Egypt had been eased by the religious intolerance of the Byzantine, as it had happened in Syria. Today, many people might find surprising that the defense of religious minorities came from Islam, but that was actually what actually happened in the 7th century. The Islam of the age of the conquest was generally tolerant and took great advantage from the sectarianism that pervaded the Eastern Roman Empire. With the conquest, relatively little change in the daily life of the Egyptian people in the short term. Most of the population simply continued with the incessant work of the irrigation-dependent agriculture which had been going on for millennia. The Egyptians were taxed, but, at least initially, certainly not more than they had been by the empire. On the other hand, religious persecutions had ceased. Converting those who paid the jizya wouldn't have been a very good deal for the new rulers of Egypt. This tax served to pay regular the Caliphate armies, to maintain the widows, the orphans, the disabled, and the elderly of the ʿUmar. We owe to the ascetic Caliph ʿUmar, who used to live in a mud hut without even a door, the creation of the first welfare state in history. Another merit of ʿUmar was his foresight that the conquests exposed the Arabs to the risk of a rapid assimilation amongst the masses of subject people. He forbade to the Arabs the appropriation by means of regular purchases of land in the new countries, preferring that the believers resided in fortified locations where the interaction with the locals was kept to a minimum. This was the origin of cities like Kufa and Basra in Mesopotamia, or like Kairouan in what is now Tunisia. Also in Egypt, ʿUmar ordered that the Arabs founded their own city, Al-Fustat, a name that alludes to the tents pitched during the siege of the Babylon fortress, or to the moat, in Byzantine Greek Phosaton, that surrounded it. It became the new capital of Egypt, not far from the ancient Memphis. Al-Fustat was the place where Cyrus had come to sign the capitulation of Alexandria. This segregation helped the Arab, together with their religion, to retain their language, which would be later on adopted by their subject. My Arabic teacher used to say that Arabic is the most modern among ancient languages and the most ancient among modern ones. The continuity of Arabic is truly amazing and provides great insight in ancient linguistic phenomena. If Caliph ʿUmar came back to life today, he would probably be able to follow the daily news announced in standard Arabic by Al Jazeera. Needless to say, none of his European contemporaries would have a chance with the daily news of their respective countries. The policy of ʿUmar was possible because the conquerors did not aspire to become farmers. Their ethos of nomadic warriors who looked down upon sedentary populations led them always to new conquests, which from Egypt would soon extend to the rest of North Africa. The Arabs were different from the Germanic tribes that had invaded southern Europe. The Germans had contended for millennia their meager fields to the blanket of forest that covered Europe, and dreamed about the prodigious fertility of the southern lands. When they eventually reached the rich plains of the southern countries, they scattered themselves on them and ended up being assimilated by the culture of their subjects. One warlike people after the other, the Goths, the Burgundian, the Franks, the Lombard. Caliph ʿUmar died in 644, assassinated by a Persian Christian while praying in the mosque of Medina. When he died, the community that only 15 years earlier controlled only a small city in Arabia had gained control of a territory that stretched from Libya to eastern Iran. It had been Abu Bakr who, on his deathbed, had recommended ʿUmar as second caliph. After the death of ʿUmar, the decision on his successor fell on a council of the Prophet companions, and they chose Uthman bin Affan, a wealthy merchant and good administrator. For the third time, the choice had not fallen upon the man whom many considered the natural successor of the Prophet, his son-in-law and cousin, Ali. Ali was a pious Muslim and conformed to these decisions, which would nevertheless produce dramatic developments a few years later. He said, initially it seemed that not much would change for the inhabitants of Egypt under the Arab conquests. Their taxes were going to the Caliphate instead of going to Constantinople, but they were probably less heavy than before. The Arabs had still no bureaucracy and no clergy to sustain. In addition, the new Muslim rulers were not trying to convert the Copts, a much welcome change. They spoke Arabic, but they were few, probably 100,000, including the families that gradually joined them on a population of about 3 million. They resided in their new city, Al-Fustat, and lived on Egypt's taxes, but they did not take the land, the property, and the jobs of the Egyptian people. Greek remained the language of the administration for several decades, and those who worked for the administration adapted to the new situation. There was therefore a certain professional continuity, always important for social peace. Amr bin al-As died in 664, with a reputation in Egypt of a righteous man. A Coptic writer, John of Nicaea, who did not spare his criticism for the Arabs, recognized that Amr limited himself to demanding the payment of the agreed tributes, without committing acts of spoliation or plunder, and always respecting the property of the church. In spite of this continuity, the consequences of the Arab conquests were huge. Within 5 years, from 638 to 642, of the 5 patriarchates which used to rule the Christian ecumeny, 3 had practically ceased to exist: Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria. The institution of the Roman papacy was thereby immensely reinforced. Over the following decades, the popes in Rome would oppose the imperial design with increasing determination, and eventually managed to find the protection of a new Roman Empire legitimated and named by them to replace that of Constantinople. From the economic perspective, the exports of Egypt were very soon redirected. A new channel dug by the Arabs between the Nile and the Red Sea allowed for Egypt's valuable exports to reach Medina and Mecca instead of Constantinople. Egypt, as also Palestine and Syria, became thereby part of a new economic space which included Mesopotamia and Iran, territories that had been for centuries under the control of the hostile Sassanids. The unification under the Caliphate of those regions would provide a formidable impulse for economic growth and durably change the trade flows of Northern Africa and the Levant, attracting towards the east the commodities that from time immemorial reached the northern shores of the Mediterranean Sea. A serious problem for Europe was the loss of Egyptian papyrus. In the early Middle Ages, owning a few sheep or goats was enough to save a man from starvation. Who could afford to sacrifice an entire flock to get a book? Not to mention the enormous amount of work for the preparation of the parchment, makeup and writing of codices. A sudden replacement of papyrus with parchment was unthinkable. Thus, it was writing that contracted, and reading along with it. Until Egypt was conquered, in the barbarian kingdoms of Europe, the practice of writing had been preserved, although non-religious education and the correct use of Latins had long since ended. Administrative and legal procedures continued to be based on papyrus, as well as the bookkeeping of merchants, private correspondence, etc. Throughout antiquity, a huge export business of papyri had radiated from Alexandria. When this ended, only the Church in Europe held stock of papyrus. The loss of Egypt was a silent blow to the European civilization. When, 100 years later, the Carolingian dynasty ruled most of Europe, none of the powerful ancestors of Charlemagne, and not even Charlemagne, was anymore able to write. Finally, the people of Egypt, with their navigation and shipbuilding skills, will soon grant to the Caliphate the ability to compete with the Byzantine on naval warfare, a factor that changed the course of European history. But let's leave that for the next lectures. In the next lecture, we will have a look at Northern Africa in the late antiquity. For now, thank you for your interest and